Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is Arik Brückner. He is the creator of a new app called Choice, which is intended to be like the Uber or the Airbnb of paid companionship, including social companionship, i.e. it's designed to have maximal safety safeguards in place from a tech perspective. He goes into what that means in detail, and we debated at some length the ethics of the sex industry in general, whether or not making the sex industry safe is enough or whether there is an essential problem with it which can't be magicked away with sophisticated safety tech. Particularly in the extended version of the episode, we really got into the weeds about some of the political philosophy behind our differing perspectives on this question. That paid extended version of the episode is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where, as always, you can also find the bonus episodes I do with my husband, all of the old extended episodes. I've also started doing some live stream AMAs on Substack. So I did one with Rob Henderson in January, which is now available. The recording of it is available to paid subs. I've got two scheduled soon with Helen Roy and with Alex Kashuta, who've both been on the podcast previously. And there's also the Substack chat, which is very busy. Lots of fantastic conversations going on there. So all of that is available at louiseperry.substack.com. Arik, should we start by talking about your business? What is the Choice app? Try pitching it to an audience who may be quite skeptical.
Sure. So, well, in its essence, it's a safe platform for providing and requesting paid companionship and intimacy services within legal boundaries in each given jurisdiction over the web.
I've heard it described as the Airbnb of companionship.
The reason we use these references, you could, say the Airbnb or the Uber of, disregarding the actual companies, but more what they did for society or the amount of trust they built. Because, the reference is, it used to be unsafe to go into a stranger's car. It used to be unsafe to let strangers into your home. Yet today, it's ubiquitous that this is happening. I'm not saying it's always safe, but it's a lot safer than it used to be, and it's happening more frequently. And the only difference is software.
So it's pitched as, people... Well, does it have to include payment? I mean, are there examples of people finding sort of free companionship, non-sexual companionship that your app would host?
Technically, it's up to the provider to say whether or not they would want to charge for their time. The reason right now is we try to avoid price dumping. So there is a minimum price as a protection right now because paid companionship is still heavily stigmatized. So we actually built the product or the platform together with the provider community. And so one of the measures was that we just make sure there's no price dumping or a negative spiral of pricing by, just people dropping below a certain threshold.
Okay, so right now it's necessarily paid, but it's not necessarily sex, right? Like the companionship could, in theory, be of all kinds.
So actually, that's how the company started. So I'm from the B2B software as a service space. So we built a sales app before and then sold that. And during my time off, I was thinking about what I wanted to do next. And the more natural thing, or the most natural thing, would have been to just, create another B2B SaaS application. And I wanted to do something that had an impact on society and is something that potentially for various reasons is not being done. And I believe in the paid companionship sector, there is currently a bit of an adverse selection of founder ethics, so to say, because all the founders in a historically unethical business segment are treated the same way, creating a disincentive for ethical founders to enter said business segment. And that's one of the motivations. That was one of the motivations for me to say, I think this is needed. And I think a technologically advanced platform is needed. And this market especially is not being served a technologically advanced solution right now.
Like OnlyFans, I remember when OnlyFans first came on the scene, it was pitched as, you can get yoga classes, you can get cooking classes, you can do all this stuff. And then, of course, it ended up being like, in practice, like 100% sex work, right? Do you expect choice to go in the same direction inevitably? Because if an app becomes associated with the sex industry, it tends to become exclusively associated with that, or are you trying very hard to resist that market tendency?
We're actually trying very hard to, I would say we don't even have that market tendency, but we're also very small still in terms of a brand. So, we couldn't compare ourselves to OnlyFans, but I think as management, as a business, you do control what you do and how you market your platform. So since the beginning, safety was at the forefront. So everything we do is around, first and foremost, providing a safe platform, because a lot of the other topics are tied to safety. So, for example, when you think about gender equity or gender equilibrium, it's tied to safety. Because when we did research, we ran a survey across male clients or potential clients that are male identifying, and another sample among female clients. Because there's a gender stereotype that the provider is always female and the client is always male. Well, the surprising and not so surprising feedback was that the number one priority for female clients is safety. And the number one priority for the male clients in the sample was profile verification.
When you say profile verification,
of
you mean the
provider.
person, okay, so the seller is who they say they are? Is that?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that explains a lot of things about the systematic issues in the market, because the current platforms out there work a lot like yellow pages. So it's basically online phone books. They're even called directories, which is not safe. So we're basically systematically excluding clients worried about safety, which, in that sample, where the number one priority was safety for female clients. So it's not that the market doesn't exist. It's just that we think a lot of it is tied to the way the service spectrum is presented, offered, and requested. For example, you asked me, not everything has to be about sex. One thing that struck me during the research was also how many nuances there are between companionship and sex. So there's, like proximity, hugging. There's intimacy, like cuddling, holding hands, and kissing, for example, where right now the way the directories or the existing platforms work is extremely heavily pushing towards sexual intimacy. So it's no wonder that that's the perception of society towards this market.
Rachel Moran, who is the terminology here is very fraught. Inevitably, I'll be inconsistent. Rachel describes herself as a prostitution survivor. She says on this point about not all men actually want to have sex, that she tended to prefer the men who had weird fetishes, because it meant that she didn't actually have to touch them necessarily or have sex with them. But anyway, yes, I mean, that is often remarked that some clients don't necessarily want to have full sex with women normally. I mean, I take the point that there are female buyers, and of course there are male sellers. I mean, presumably the gay market is a big one, but we are still mostly talking about men. I mean, did you have any numbers on the proportion of men who are interested in buying sexual services through the app versus female?
Yeah, on our platform, the ratio is still heavily skewed to male clients, but not requesting sexual services. So it's interesting, by a factor of 4, actually, The most frequent category is 20 to 35-year-old male clients requesting a coffee date. So it's a companionship meeting with predominantly dominatrixes to talk about BDSM.
Interesting.
And I think it's an angle that the sex work community, and I say sex work community not because all sex workers provide sexual services, but if you talk about the community, a lot of people who don't provide sexual services would also identify as being part of that community. That's why I use that term. And terminology is extremely important when talking about this market or industry or activity or job. It's kind of an educational category. And we believe it has, again, to do with safety. Because right now, on existing directories that are very explicit in nature, clients that are concerned about their own safety, but also the safety of the provider, are refraining from requesting the services across the spectrum. Especially, and I think that's something that we believe, or that's a thesis, we believe that especially the clients seeking services on the non-sexual spectrum, so meaning companionship, proximity, or non-sexual intimacy, are shying away from requesting those services because all the platforms that offer anything similar are very explicit in nature. It's like, would you go on a platform that has, a lot of nudity to request holding hands? It's kind of counterintuitive, right? Nevertheless, in a survey that we conducted across 730 plus providers globally, so in Europe, Australia, and the US, we asked, what percentage of meetings would you say is non-sexual? So can be intimate, can be proximity, but is non-sexual. And the consensus was, personally, to me, astonishingly high, with 40%. So, yeah, I do believe a lot of it is tied to access and communication and presentation and, well, technology in the end to build trust and safety.
I guess this is a perennial issue with examining the sex industry, that there's a massive range of what comes under the category, right? So you've got your high-end dominatrices at one end, right? And then you've got pimped women in brothels or on the street, right, at the other end. And one significant challenge is trying to design any kind of research study that includes those women at the really grim end, because those women will tend not to be really accessible to academics. They're not on Twitter, they're not responding to online polls, things like that, right? So presumably that sample would probably be at the less grim end that you're mostly sampling from. But look, I take the point that the sex industry, there are men and women who sell sexual services of any kind, particularly, right, if it's things like camming or being a dominatrix or other things that don't involve like full contact, who consider that to be a better job than alternative jobs for them, right? I did a debate with Ayla, who you may know, a couple of years ago, and I totally accept that Ayla is one of these outlier women, right? She's sort of fully chosen this compared with the other options available to her, and she has a relatively good time doing it. And particularly, there are some types of sex work which are safer and which men and women tend to prefer. So talk to me about that. So if we're accepting that, right, if we're accepting that you can maybe make this better for those people. There are some critics of the sex industry who wouldn't accept that. But if we accept that, talk to me about your safety mechanisms. How is it that you are trying to make this as safe as possible for this segment of the sex industry that might be well suited to this app?
Yeah, I want to add something to that as well. I wouldn't necessarily agree to saying that this is only available to that, described segment of sex workers. Not initially, but eventually technology has shown that it can be made available, across a very wide spectrum, maybe not the entire spectrum, but given that we are so far away currently from what's technically possible in safety technology to where we are. Like just a very simple example. We are talking about age verification for adult entertainment in the US, where as of 1st of January, in 19 states, there's age verification requirement for adult entertainment online. Nobody is talking about client age verification for physical meetings. So even right now in the US, even if you have to age verify for accessing adult entertainment, you still don't have to age verify for most platforms to just start chatting with somebody providing or offering sexual intimacy services, which it's just
in states where that's legal, right? I mean, there's quite a lot of variation, isn't there, in the states in terms of the legislation around prostitution?
Yeah, but there's a lot of directories even in the US, that are very clear around the branding and the insinuation, or not even the insinuation, but also like the actual service that's being offered. So what we are doing is, first of all, we establish a behavioral code of conduct, the choice code, which is basic in the sense that it's around respectful communication, respectful behavior, respect of boundaries, etc. It also defines the service as a best effort basis. So there's no guarantee. Just because you pay for someone's time doesn't mean they provide all the services that you previously agreed on, because especially when it's around intimacy, consent can always be withdrawn. Also, if it's not around intimacy, like companionship, like nobody can force you to do any job, right? I mean, you can always quit or just walk out of the office. And I think it's just important that this is written. Everybody agrees to that. Then there is identification, a big issue, or identity verification. A big issue in the market is there's no way of blocking people. There's no way. Because the entire market is based on phone numbers, and everybody knows how easily phone numbers can be, exchanged, replaced. So it's not a robust mechanism to build a blocking system or a safe system. And that's why everybody on choice for physical meetings is ID verified, effectively making it possible to block someone indefinitely. I mean, and we use a banking grade system. So we use actually the same system as a lot of the fintechs like Revolut. So, to be able to forge an identity document and take a selfie that passes that system is probably not impossible, but just very, very difficult. A lot more difficult than getting a new phone number. Then it's around reporting. So being able to report behavioral guideline violations. We believe that the fact that people need to go through the verification process and also scan their ID, take a selfie, that's already we believe, a big filter for, filtering out people with bad intentions or misconduct in general. So being able from within the chat to immediately see, has this person, were there any reports of behavioral guideline violations of this person? Always minor, right? Because major ones would anyway lead to blocking of the account. They wouldn't even be on the platform. So have there been previous reports, and the ability to easily report it, not like just write an email to security at whatever. That's not a reporting mechanism, right? So you're in the chat and it says, do you want to make a behavioral violation report? And we actually had 2 cases of that so far. And that brings me to the next point, which is payment processing. A lot of the imbalance in power or power dynamics or negotiation position, whatever you want to call it, in the current way this industry is administered, at least the in-person one, is around payment happening on the spot. because on the provider side, there's preparation time. You need to prepare for a meeting. You need to potentially travel to a location. There's no way that if a meeting gets canceled on short notice, you'll get, another client for the same amount or for the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So payment processing is quite important, I believe, and that's why we've opted for processing the full service fee with an escrow service, where the client side needs to deposit the entire fee for the service into escrow with us until the meeting happens. And there's a check-in process to confirm that the verified people are actually the ones who meet. Because otherwise somebody could make a booking and some other person could just show up.
Are the funds released at the beginning of the meeting or the end?
Yes. So upon successful check-in, funds are released.
Okay.
Because that's in line with the terms and conditions of it being a best effort meeting, right? Mm-hmm. Payment processing is critical and very challenging. We had 2 safety incidents on the platform already, prevented ones, mm-hmm. because of the payment processing. It was 2 incidents of something called boundary pushing. So a provider on our platform that is not offering sexual services was tried to be convinced, or to a certain extent also threatened, to offer sexual services, mm-hmm. of a meeting that was already requested, accepted, and the ID, verified and prepaid. So it was in these 2 cases, it was very easy for the provider to report the behavioral misconduct, share a screenshot. We approved it, and the funds were released. Because obviously, in this scenario, a provider would not feel safe anymore meeting with this client. But it's important that there is no damage to the provider, because otherwise, what's happening in the market is the more pressure you have as a provider, the more you would sacrifice your safety guidelines for additional, or for avoiding the risk of not receiving the funds. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, there's a risk on the client. I mean, this, of course, switches whenever you flip the genders, right? As soon as the client becomes female or any other gender identity that's more concerned with safety, than maybe the cisgender male population in our sample of the survey, then it flips, right? So then you just have the same priorities and mechanisms protecting the client side. And then there's the reporting at the end, the mandatory reporting at the end of the meeting. Mm-hmm. So we enforce meeting feedback always at the end of the meeting, which means you need to answer 2 questions. Were the behavioral guidelines respected? And would you want to repeat this experience? The reason for the second question is, as you mentioned, there's a huge spectrum of providers and services. It's very difficult to introduce reviews or a review system, because it's very subjective. Mm-hmm. And it's also very subjective or unique to the provider-client relationship or day or situation. So that's what we do. And you cannot use the app in any capacity without providing feedback for the previous meeting.
Do you do criminal record checks?
Currently, we don't, but we have found a platform that enables us to do that. It's just that right now, the biggest challenge right now is actually provider skepticism. Mm. So even though we don't charge anything from to providers, we only charge the client side. There's a big component about this being a new brand, and very understandable skepticism that the intentions are eventually going to be bad, because that's historically what just happened a lot in this industry. Mm-hmm. So it's just going to be, a lot of work, but also a lot of impact, I believe, that we can have with technology like this.
Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. There are obviously different legislative regimes around the sex industry. In Britain, for instance, I think that this would be totally legal, but because
legal or illegal?
Sorry, legal.
Okay.
Because brothel keeping is illegal, and there are some associated crimes, right, with the sex industry, but the central transaction is not criminalized in this country.
In the UK, and so we try to work together with governments as well. So we had several meetings with government bodies of the UK government already. It's still illegal to be an intermediary to a paid sexual intimacy transaction. But again, to protect both sides to the meeting, we always make sure that only legal services can be provided in a given jurisdiction, and only legal services can be requested. So that's really important. And also, just if you look at macro statistics, it's just companionship has to be the bigger problem and has to be the bigger, because effectively you look at isolation and loneliness statistics, and there's also interesting research around paid companionship and how this could be a potential intervention for even chronic loneliness, not a solution, but a very punctual intervention to get people back into a mode where they can foster naturally foster social interactions again. That, together with dating app frustration levels on both sides, like for example, 3% of the top male profiles are getting 97% of matches, which just means that 97% of the male profiles need to be somehow frustrated. And at the same time, you have statistics around female users on dating apps that are also frustrated because of the inundation of messages and the way, so non-consensual intimate imagery, or non-solicited intimate imagery, as well as non-respectful communication in general. It's just that there is no way, really, in my opinion, there's no way of safely accessing paid companionship as companionship.
I mean, dating apps is an interesting comparison, right? Because dating apps are not generally, obviously there are examples of people being assaulted or having terrible experiences offline with dating apps. And as you say, getting unwanted dick pics and stuff like that, right? But mostly the objections to dating apps do not come from those kind of outlier bad experiences. They come from actually innate sex differences kind of displaying themselves. Right? The reason that you have a minority of highly attractive men getting most of the attention is because of the female hypergamy instinct. And the reason that you have women being inundated with unwanted messages is because men are generally incentivized to kind of, I don't know how to put this politely, try their best with as many women as possible, right? Give it a go. So these are, I think the reason that people find dating apps an unhappy setting is because it kind of unleashes some of the more dysfunctional impulses in both men and women.
It's also the clear incentive of the dating app to not make users happy.
Yes, you don't want to get married and then leave the dating app. You want to be perpetually, yeah. I mean, that was kind of linked to the next question I was going to ask about your app, which is, it's not a new thing, right, to try and make the sex industry safe. This is the key motivation to most pushes to legalize or decriminalize the industry. And what tends to happen pretty reliably in places where that's attempted is that the hope is, you will have sex workers who have basically normal, I mean, they're typically self-employed, but they'll have things like maternity leave, they'll have pensions, the idealistic goal is always to try and make it like a normal job and to remove pimps and to remove violence and all of this. And those attempts very, very reliably fail. There's something about this industry which tends to attract criminality and tends to attract, I mean, I think the best theory as to why that is that the male demand to buy sex is much greater than the female demand to sell it, or at least to sell it willingly. There aren't very many Aylas in the world, right? There aren't very many women who are really willing to sell sex. And so women kind of have to be sought who, I mean, we know what goes on in, say, the German mega brothels, which are full of like Eastern European women who don't really want to be there. I think the reason that the industry always tends towards darkness is because actually the number of women who are willing to do this without serious coercion is very small. Do you worry that your act could go in the same direction, that with the best will in the world, there will be ways in which it will become unsafe nevertheless?
When you make that statement that, the majority, of providers, like let's use a gender neutral term, but yeah, the majority is there is indications that the majority is female.
Mm-hmm.
When you say the majority of the providers is not doing this willingly, there's not that many Aylas in the world.
Mm-hmm.
What like statistical basis do you base that on?
It's inherently unknowable. I mean, this is part of the problem with the whole industry, that it's very murky, and accessing the women who are least willing to be there, they are also the hardest to access, right? The ones who you hear the most from tend to be the ones who are in the best position, right? Who have the most resources available, who speak English, there are so many factors which make someone both less vulnerable and more accessible to the media and to academic researchers and so on. So it's a very difficult thing to know.
Mm-hmm.
We can confidently say, at least anecdotally, and I've spoken to women like this for this podcast,
Mm-hmm.
that there are definitely women who end up in the sex industry who absolutely do not want to be there, right?
Yeah.
I think everyone agrees on that.
I think there's you'd probably, I mean, you'd be able to make an example of any industry and say people are there willingly and in a self-determined way, or and other people are there not willingly.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that you can make, that you can create examples of both extremes still doesn't mean that it's the majority. But nevertheless, I think that the data in general is terrible
Mm-hmm.
in this industry, and that's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing that we try to address. So at least if this industry was on our platform, or part of it at least, we would at least have data. We would know how many meetings are actually happening, what kind of meetings are those, and do they go well or not. Like, even if they don't go well, at least we would know. Right now there's absolutely zero data on how many meetings are actually happening, because nobody's tracking that. I think the data that we have indicates that there is sort of a normal distribution, just because the market is huge. Mm-hmm. So if you take, and again, there's just estimates, right? There's no real market figures. But if you take, for example, IMF, World Bank, and UN estimates, and you take a cross section of that, you would get to anywhere between 0.5 to 2% of global GDP. So and I mean, just in comparison of these figures, the entire financial services sector is at around 25 to 30%. Mm-hmm. Like the entire, like including insurance and banking and everything. So
does that include the porn industry?
Yeah, not the porn, but the CAM, so remote sex work industry.
Okay,
yes.
Right.
But again, it already starts there. Like, try defining a sex worker. Like even that definition is very difficult. Like, is it someone who does this as a full-time job, does it as a part-time job, did it once in their lifetime, did it for 1 year? Like even that in terms of frequency, but then also in terms of service spectrum, that can evolve, of course, that can change based on client type, etc. There are certain indicators, I think, that we can run numbers on, or at least approach some statistical data. That is, for example, people who have, a professional website, individual to them, that, have a documented screening process, that are laying out or have different channels where they promote their profile, like, a valid social media profile, their own website, and then ads on, well, the more reputable directories, let's put it that way. And even if you run, stats on that, you get to quite large numbers. So, for example, you could run a search on X with like commonly used terms in profiles of providers. And alone in the US, you'd get to around 150,000. I'm not saying all of them are, completely verified, but at least that's a number that has an X profile with certain terms in there, an email address on a particular safe or secure messaging platform, and a website. But again, given the lack of data material, I can't counter, your argument. I'm just saying it's very difficult to make any statement, concluding from examples, horrific examples, to a very large population is just a dangerous thing to do. Let's talk about, the legislative models. I think that's an interesting discussion. I would say that decriminalization is not done in a very meaningful fashion. I still think it's better than criminalization and better than partial criminalization, so the Nordic model, for the simple reason that if we say that this market exists, whether it is legal or illegal, and that, I think we can agree on that. In any country, this market exists.
I do agree, although I'd say that the size of the market depends on the legislative model. But go on with your point, and then I can get to that.
I would agree. I mean, the market definitely reduces in size once it's being decriminalized or partially decriminalized. The question is, which part of the market, goes away? And I would argue that if you have a market where it is legal and you have a mix of bad actors and good actors in that market, and you make that market illegal or partially illegal, and it remains to exist, the people who typically respect boundaries or the law would probably be the people who exit the market.
Yeah.
And the people remaining would be the ones that typically don't have a respect for the law, or potentially don't have a respect for boundaries, that are communicated or set by providers.
Yeah.
I think that's why I would say, even in the different forms right now, and even if we agree that decriminalization is not done in the best way, I still think it's better than criminalization or partial criminalization. However, I think governments really struggle to find a meaningful way to regulate the industry. And I think that's where technology should come into play and say, what can we do from a government perspective to create boundaries and rules in this industry? Take gambling. There are two reasons. I mean, I don't know the gambling laws in the entire world, but intuitively speaking, in Switzerland, when you walk into a casino, you have to show ID. And there's two reasons for that. One is the casino needs to know if you're an adult, and they also need to know if you are blocked, or if you're on a blocked list because of gambling addiction, for example. Why are we not, introducing the same kind of mechanics for paid companionship? there I think we go into, I think, the root cause of why it attracts, of why the business or the industry attracts dodginess or shadiness. I think it's because of the stigma. Because the stigma starts with not necessarily society. Potentially society is even further than we think or than the media, reports. I think it's the stigma that comes from governments, not in terms of paternity leave and stuff like that. I mean, that's still a big if, how well that is implemented in the end, because like Belgium, for example, passed new paternity and maternity leave laws that is intended to protect providers. It's still to be seen whether or not providers will be employed, or whether then in turn they just have to stay freelancers to not get these protections, or for the employer not to have to offer these protections. There's a lot that governments need to actually do. And first and foremost, I think it's still simple things like payment. If the government would just say, you know what, banks have to accept you if you want to open an account. They have to offer you payment services so that you can actually get protected against no-shows, against this imbalance in negotiation power. You don't have to accept cash payments, stuff like that. That would already be a huge step, together with the age identity verification.
So I think the point where we disagree, I'm with you on a lot of this, right? But I think the point where we disagree is I'm reminded of something that Vednita Carter said. She's a sex trade survivor, American, and she works for Space International, which is a lobby group for the Nordic model, right? So for listeners who don't know, the Nordic model basically criminalizes the clients and decriminalizes the providers. In theory, the idea is that the police show up at a brothel and they arrest the men, and they give the women help through social workers, right? That's in theory how it's supposed to work. So it's only half of the transaction is criminalized. And the thing that Vednita said when I saw her speak some years ago, which stuck with me, is that there are lots of bad things associated with the sex industry that we've been talking about, like the risk of violence, the risk of disease, all of this stuff, right? But the thing that she said is the abuse is the sex itself, in the sense that for women, I think that this is where we get to like quite an important innate sex difference, which I've written about previously. Women have a different response to sex than men do in general. I'm generalizing here. Women suffer more risks from sex, not just in terms of violence, but in terms of pregnancy, right? Like that's what sex is for at the end of the day. And it means that we have evolved to have a different selection mechanism. Basically, women are much, much more fussy about who they will have sex with when no money is changing hands, because having sex is basically the most consequential decision a woman can make in her life, because it can result in pregnancy, which, in the ancestral environment and still now leads to some very difficult decisions relating to, do you raise this child? Do you commit infanticide? Do you seek out an abortion? Whatever it is, right? This is very serious stuff for women. Whereas for men, it isn't very serious stuff, really, because it's very easy for men to just impregnate a woman in like 30 seconds and then never see her ever again and have nothing to do with this child. I think this means, and this isn't like, I don't think this is a controversial thing to say. I think with the evolutionary psychology literature, this is a completely anodyne thing to say. Men and women have different styles of sexuality, where men tend to be much more eager to have casual sex, and women tend to be much, much less eager to do that. And particularly women tend to be very uneager to have sex with men that they find unattractive or scary or just don't like, and what prostitution is, even if you get rid of the violence, even if you get rid of the other kind of abuse and criminality, what prostitution is women having sex with men who they would not have sex with if it weren't for the fact that they're being paid. So there's like an inherent, this is what Vednita means by like, the sex is the abuse. And I guess my concern about, not your app necessarily, I mean, I think that I think that of all the measures to try and make this industry less violent, like this is a good one. So I don't want to give you a hard time because I feel like you're doing like a better thing than the vast majority of people are in this space. But the problem with, say, a legal regime which decriminalizes or legalizes the industry is that it lowers the threshold for men to buy sex. And you're right, that means generally it's the men who would not otherwise do so, who are doing so, right? And yes, maybe those men will be less violent, they'll be less likely to push boundaries, they'll be nicer customers. I think that's probably a fair assumption. But it is still the case that when you create demand, the demand is met by desperate women. And those desperate women find unwanted sex really, really unpleasant, even if the man is otherwise fine. Does that make sense? I know that this is a kind of controversial claim within, say, progressive circles, but I don't think it's a controversial claim among evolutionary psychologists who study human sexuality.
Yeah, a couple of things to comment on that. Mm-hmm. Just to start, I think its terminology is really important. So you mentioned, or you used prostitution as a word. Mm-hmm. The coin or the term sex work got introduced by Carol Lee in, I think, 1979 or something, to create a word or an expression for the self-determined consensual form of paid sexual intimacy, or, I mean, also depending on the definition, the extended form with the other, like non-sexual paid companionship.
Things like camming and
spectrums,
whatever.
Yeah. Or even just escorting, is also kind of summarized, even though it has nothing to do with sex. I mean, that's why we're trying also to destigmatize through just calling the service what it is, and when it is of sexual nature, to call it sexual, and when it isn't, to also not call it that. Prostitution, on the other hand, includes, as a definition, also the criminal activity in the market. So I think it's just important to just know or understand what we're talking about, because one is not the same necessarily as the other.
Sure. How about we say paid sex, to be precise?
Paid sex, absolutely.
And
just a neutral term. Yeah, I think it's just important. And then around perception of sexuality or of sex between, men, women, other gender identities, I think two adults, and I'm going to quote, Jessica Flanagan here. She's an ethics professor at the University of Redmond, and she says in her in part of the book that she wrote, Debating Sex Work, she says two adults can have sex for whichever reason they want to, as long as it's ongoing, consensual. And pecuniary remuneration, the fact that it's paid sex, does not make someone, an adult person, incapable of giving ongoing consent to something. The motivation may be different, why they consent, right? To your point, clearly if it's paid, you do things that otherwise you wouldn't do. But that's valid again for any job. Probably if we wouldn't get paid in a lot of jobs, there's a lot of things we wouldn't do. We wouldn't do night shifts. We wouldn't move with our entire family to another country, take them out of school, move somewhere. We wouldn't, sacrifice a lot of things for jobs, career development, but also effectively payment. So with that, I would argue that by increasing the market, but in a meaningful way, like increasing the market in a nuanced way, so that you don't have to go through an explicit, unsecure booking process to have access to this market, but in a regulated, safe way, or as safe as possible way. I mean, meeting with strangers will never be safe. I'm not saying technology can do that. It's arguably leading to more choice. So, back to your point of, let's say that thesis holds up, that sex affects women more than men. In a paid sex scenario, having more choice to say no to customers or clients because of aesthetics or because of whatever reason actually would actually lead to a reduction in unwanted or less wanted paid sexual interactions. And I would actually, go a step further and say, and this is actually our objective, is given that if you believe macro statistics, the market for paid companionship, like non-sexual paid companionship, should actually or has to be larger If we manage to destigmatize that part, we would also create a market for non-sexual interactions, not carrying any of the risks, such as pregnancy, for example, and still be able to offer a very valid high-income alternative or additional job or activity. I'll give you an example for that. There's lots of retirement homes, right? We have an aging population, well, probably in most countries. If you would ask a nurse to hold hands with a patient, it would be considered unprofessional or overstepping boundaries of the activity or the job description, the professional environment of a nurse. For companionship, for example.
Is that true for holding hands? I had some injections in my back the other week, and the nurse offered to hold my hand throughout, and I said, I'm a big girl, I don't need you to hold my hand. But
I'm not saying that's valid across the board. I'm just saying that there's probably large retirement clinics that would be very worried about the potential legal consequences that
worried about safeguarding,
offering something like that or not could carry. If you would offer the same opportunity to somebody who would not enjoy paid sexual interactions as much as others, maybe, that would be potentially a very nice alternative to a certain subset of providers, which currently is not really accessible. It's very difficult to actually get paid companionship or holding hands. Like, try getting that as a service, paying for it without seeing nudity. That's actually very difficult, And then the other argument I would make, because you said the perception of, female bodies or the feeling or the consequences, the impact of sex is different than for male or people with male bodies or with bodies that have a penis.
You can just say men on this podcast. Okay, honestly, cool. We're not gonna.
All right. Would actually, I think, create an argument for a gender equal distribution of providers. Like, because female pleasure is more complex, I think we can say that or agree on that. I think female pleasure is in general more complex than male pleasure. Having a market for female pleasure in a safe way could actually lead to better experiences or better intimate or sexual experiences for women.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.